This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 56 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry, and for today's episode, we'll be doing a season recap of sorts, as we'll be handing out some awards. We'll have some obvious categories like Fantasy MVP, Biggest Bust, things like that, but we'll also have some kind of unique and fun categories to explore as well for this episode. But before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show. We are on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod, and now verified, we are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now for our first category, we will start with Game Performance of the Year, and I have 4 candidates for this category. So first off, Devon Achane, Week 3. He had 51.3 PPR points. That is the most points by any running back in a game this season. And in fact, it's the only running back this season to have a game exceeding 50 points. In that game in Week 5, he had 18 carries for 203 rushing yards. He had another 4 receptions for 30 yards, which was a target per route run rate of actually 50%, as he only ran 8 routes in that game. He had 4 total touchdowns, 2 rushing plus 2 receiving. He had over 11 yards per carry and 7.5 yards per reception. And most impressively, he did all of that on just 30 snaps. And if you look at all the games this year where a running back broke 30 PPR points, the average number of snaps played was 47 snaps. That's a delta of 17 fewer for Achane in this Week 3 game. Candidate 2 is Breece Hall in Week 16, which would be the fantasy playoffs. He scored 43.1 PPR points. That is the 4th best running back outing of the year. This was the definition of a workhorse. He had 20 rushing attempts and 16 targets on 64 snaps played. He had 95 rushing yards. He caught 12 of 16 targets for 96 receiving yards. That's 191 total yards with 2 touchdowns. Breece Hall finished just short of 100 total PPR points combined over the last 3 weeks of the season, but his Week 16 performance was the best and most timely of those that made the playoffs with him. Option 3, Jamar Chase in Week 5. He had 52.2 PPR points. That's the most of any wide receiver on the season. He played 75 snaps in this game against Arizona. He had 19 targets, which was a 43% target share. He caught 15 of 19 targets, 192 yards, and 3 touchdowns. His catch rate was almost 80% on those 19 targets, and his target per route run rate was just short of 40%. He had almost half of the team's air yards in this contest. He had 147 air yards in total in Week 5. And then the last candidate, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns in Week 16. He had 51.5 PPR points. That is the 2nd most points by a wide receiver on the season. But Cooper did this in the fantasy playoffs. He caught only 11 of 15 targets, a 73% catch rate, but he went for 265 receiving yards, the most by any wide receiver on the season. He averaged 24 yards per reception. He had a target per route run rate exceeding 40% with an average depth of target of almost 19 yards. He accounted for almost 2/3 of the Browns' air yards, and 283 air yards, again, is the most air yards of any wide receiver in a game this season. And the winner of the Game Performance of the Year will go to Jamar Chase with his Week 5 performance. Now, I think a lot of people would expect Devon Achane to win this award for his Week 3 game, but keep in mind, back in Week 3, Devon Achane, if you had him on your roster, he was most certainly on your bench going into Week 3. Very few people would have Devon Achane in their starting lineup in Week 3 as opposed to Jamar Chase, who was drafted as a first-round wide receiver, scored 52.2 PPR points, the most of any player at any position in any game this season. Again, Jamar Chase, Week 5, 52.2 PPR points with the Game Performance of the Year. Now let's pivot and we'll talk about the best value selection in fantasy football this season. This would be looking at where the player was drafted back in late August, early September, and of course how that corresponds to how they finished. The best value selection. Got 3 candidates here. First, Michael Pittman, the wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts. He was drafted as wide receiver 33, a mid-8th round pick back in September, 87th overall. Obviously, there was a lot of concern about what the offense would look like and more specifically the pass volume with rookie quarterback Anthony Richardson. However, Pittman finished top 15 in total points and in PPR points per game at his position. He was 9th in the league in total targets. He was 4th in total receptions, and he set career highs in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. He finished as a top 15 wide receiver in weekly scoring in 7 of his first 13 games. The second candidate, Brian Robinson Jr., the running back of the Washington Commanders. He was drafted as running back 34. He was neck and neck with teammate Antonio Gibson in the September average draft position rankings. He was around pick 100 overall. Brian Robinson would go on to finish as running back 21 in total PPR scoring, and on a points per game basis on the season, he was running back 16 from weeks 1 through 12 prior to his hamstring injury in week 13. Now, Robinson improved on his yards per carry from last year. He tripled his touchdown output compared to last year. He had 3 last year. He had 9 touchdowns this season. And most importantly, he drastically increased his receiving profile. Last season, he had 9 receptions for 60 yards. This year, he had 36 receptions for 368 yards. Of course, that's a boom in PPR formats. The last candidate, Miami running back Raheem Mostert. He was drafted as running back 42, 136 overall back in September. We're talking near the end of your bench selections back in the September ADP. Now, at the age of 31, Mostert played 15 games and he had career highs in rushing attempts. He had his first 1,000-yard rushing season of his career. He had 21 total touchdowns. That's right, 21, 18 rushing, 3 receiving. Mostert led the league in total touchdowns, and he had the highest percentage of his fantasy points coming via touchdowns. That was 47% of his fantasy production tied to his 21 total touchdowns. By comparison, the highest percentage of fantasy points coming via touchdowns of any running back in the last 3 seasons was Raheem Mostert this year. By comparison, Jamal Williams last year with Detroit, when he had that crazy season with touchdown total, it was still only 45% of his production. Mostert would go on to finish as running back 5 this season in total scoring, with 8 weeks in the top 15 in weekly scoring and 13 weeks in the top 25. Now, as much as I'd love to give this award to Michael Pittman because he was a guy that we recommended and targeted back in September as a guy who was woefully undervalued, I think the clear winner here has to be Raheem Mostert. We're talking about a guy who was taken as running back 42 near the end of your bench and became the running back 5 on the season with 21 total touchdowns. Absolutely league-winning upside compared to where you got him. We'll talk about the waiver wire pickup of the year. Now, there's a handful of guys we could target here, but I think, in all seriousness, there's only 2 options, and they're both on the same team. First, it's going to be Puka Nacua, the wide receiver of the Los Angeles Rams. He finished as wide receiver 4 in PPR scoring. He was top 10 in snaps played, targets, receptions. He was 4th in receiving yards at nearly 1,500 receiving yards. He had 6 touchdowns. He had 9 weeks inside the weekly top 15 at his position. And what's remarkable is that he did this from the get-go. Week 1, he had 15 targets and over 100 receiving yards. He was a priority waiver claim after week 1, and those that targeted him with their fab dollars were rewarded the very next week as he had 20 targets and 150 yards in week 2. Now, even when Cooper Kupp returned in week 5, Puka Nacua still averaged 15.7 PPR points per game. He was wide receiver 12 from weeks 7 through 17. By comparison, Cooper Kupp, he averaged 2 fewer points per game than Puka did. The rookie 4th round pick supplanted Cooper Kupp as the 1A in this offense for fantasy purposes. The other candidate for the waiver wire pickup of the year is teammate Kyren Williams at the running back position. Of course, he was 7th in total PPR points in 12 games played. He was 2nd in points per game at 21.4. Kyren Williams and Christian McCaffrey were the only running backs to average more than 20 points per game this season. Again, he only played 12 games, but he was top 12. He was a top 12 running back in weekly scoring in 9 of those weeks, with 6 weeks in the top 5. He finished with 15 total touchdowns, more than a third of his total fantasy production coming via touchdowns. That is the 5th highest percentage in the league this year. Kyren started the season behind Cam Akers on the depth chart, but Akers was quickly jettisoned after week 1. Now, the only negative, of course, was a high ankle sprain that took him out of your lineups from weeks 7 through 11, but Kyren was even better after his return, which typically is not the case for a running back returning from a high ankle sprain, but Kyren Williams averaged 24 PPR points per game from weeks 12 through 17. Now, I debated who to give this award to. I think both are obviously deserving, but in the end, I think Kyren Williams' 4-game stretch on IR was the difference, which is why I'm going to award the waiver wire pickup of the year to rookie wide receiver Puka Nacua. And since we talked about Puka Nacua, let's just go ahead and pivot to Rookie of the Year, because Puka Nacua is a candidate here as well. Now, I mentioned Nacua finished 4th in the NFL with over 1,400 receiving yards. He finished at 1,486. He was 9th in the league with 105 catches, which is a remarkable achievement for a rookie. Now, he also set the record for the most receiving yards in a playoff game by a rookie in Sunday's playoff loss to Detroit. Nacua finished the game with 9 catches for 181 yards and a touchdown. Now, another way we can measure rookie value is to look at their dynasty value. So I checked Fantasy Calc and looked at the value increase from the start of the season in September to where we were at the start of January. Puka Nacua had a value of 825 points based on Dynasty Superflex valuation according to Fantasy Calc. He has gone from 825 value up to 4,740 is his current value. Significant value increase. Keep in mind, as I go through some of these player valuations, that all the players mentioned increase their dynasty trade value equivalent to an early to mid first round pick, somewhere around pick 4 to pick 6, based on what the 2023 picks were going for back in August and September. So again, Nacua went from 825 to 4,740. CJ Stroud is candidate number 2. Of course, Stroud set the single-game rookie passing record with 470 yards and a comeback win over Tampa Bay earlier in the season. He had a rookie record 5 touchdowns in that game as well. He had over 4,100 passing yards. That is the 3rd most by a rookie in NFL history. And he became just the 3rd NFL player in the past 50 years to lead the league in passing yards per game and passing touchdown to interception ratio. He joins Joe Montana in 1989 and Tom Brady in 2007. Now, because of that, his Fantasy Calc value increased from 3,441 back in September up to 7,511 here at the start of January. He is now one of the top assets in all of Superflex Dynasty. And then the third option is going to be Sam Laporta, the tight end for the Detroit Lions. Of course, Laporta broke the NFL record for receptions by a rookie tight end with 82 catches this year. He also tied the rookie record in receiving touchdowns with 10 touchdowns, equaling the record set by Rob Gronkowski back in 2010. He's only the 3rd tight end in NFL history to do that. And he also ranked 6th all-time at the tight end position in receiving yards with 758. Now, his Fantasy Calc value back in September was just short of 2,000. He was at 1995, and here at the start of January, that has increased to 6,043. So all 3 of those players saw similar value appreciation, equivalent to an early to mid first round pick from the start of the season here to early January. But as for the winner of the Rookie of the Year category, I'm actually going to double dip here, and I'm going to select Puka Nacua again, not only as your waiver wire pickup of the year, but also as your Rookie of the Year. An absolutely sensational rookie season from Puka Nacua, the 4th round rookie who has now quickly become one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. Now for the next few categories, no candidates here, we just have a category and a winner, but let's start with Comeback Player of the year, and that is going to be Browns quarterback Joe Flacco, which I think is maybe the best story in the NFL this year, the reemergence of the veteran Joe Flacco. Now, he only played 12 games over the last 3 seasons, and he started this year not on any single team's roster. Now, he joined the Browns in Week 12, and he was thrust into the starter role in Week 13. And from weeks 13 through 17, he was the quarterback 3 in overall fantasy scoring. He had 4 straight 300-plus yard passing games, and all 5 games he had multiple passing touchdowns. That's more 300-yard passing games plus multi-passing touchdown games this year than guys like Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, and Jalen Hurts. And of course, he did all of that in just a 5-game sample. So Joe Flacco, the comeback player of the year. The breakout player of the year is Buccaneers running back Rachaad White. Now, the second-year running back was drafted as running back 2353 overall back in September. We're talking a late 6th, early 7th in ADP. Now, he finished as running back 4 in PPR scoring. Now, his efficiency numbers were pretty average, but his utilization was elite. He was first in the league in snaps played at the running back position. He was 3rd in rushing attempts. He was 1st in routes run. He was 4th in receptions with a catch rate above 90%. And he had a pretty slow go of it through the first month and a half of the season, even though his utilization was still strong during that opening stretch. But from weeks 7 through 18, Rachaad White was running back 6 in PPR points per game at 18 points. He played all 17 games this year, and he had 10 weeks inside the weekly top 15 at his position. So breakout player of the year is second-year running back Rachaad White. The next award is the most underappreciated asset. Now, there's these guys in fantasy football that nobody is going around saying, oh, hey, I got this guy on my team, but it is the guy who helps you win. And that guy this year was James Conner, the running back for the Arizona Cardinals. He was drafted as running back 22 back in September. We're talking a late 6th, early 7th round pick. He was ranked after players like Dameon Pierce, Miles Sanders, and Alexander Mattison. James Conner finished as running back 18 in total PPR points, but he was running back 13 in points per game on 13 games played. Now, 7 of his 13 games, he finished inside the weekly top 15 at his position, including every game week 13 on during the fantasy playoffs. The 28-year-old veteran was on a team that nobody wanted anything to do with from a fantasy standpoint at the start of the season due to Kyler Murray starting the year on PUP. Now, James Conner did have some strong usage. He averaged almost 20 total opportunities a game, but what was more surprising was his efficiency was at a career high. Conner's yards per carry broke 5 yards per carry on the season for the first time in his career. He was up from 4.3 the previous season, and he was up from 3.7 yards per carry in 2021. On top of that, he added 9 touchdowns in 13 games played this year. So James Conner, the most underappreciated asset in fantasy football. Now we're going to have some fun with the next few categories. The first one I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling the What If Player of the Year, and this is kind of in honor of what MCU does on Disney Plus with their What If show. But the question here is, what if Aaron Rodgers never tore his Achilles in the first quarter of the first game of the season? And that would make our What If Player of the Year wide receiver Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, because according to Fantasy Points data, Garrett Wilson had the largest delta on the season in actual points, which was 215, versus expected fantasy points, which was 303. That is a difference of 88 points on the season between actual points and expected points, which is a difference of 5.2 points per game from weeks 1 through 17. Now, on the entire season, Garrett Wilson was 4th in the league in total targets at 169 targets, but he was 13th in receptions. His 56% catch rate was by far the worst of all the top 10 target earners in the league, and his 3 total touchdowns was also the second worst ratio of the top 30 target earners. Garrett Wilson had 1 touchdown for every 56 targets this season. Now, the collective average of the top 30 target earners in the league this season was 1 touchdown for every 20 targets. Garrett Wilson's rate was almost 3 times as high. That helps explain why Garrett Wilson's expected fantasy points was so high, because when you earn targets at that incredibly high volume that Wilson did all season, you typically produce elite fantasy numbers, but that just was not the case this year for Garrett Wilson without consistent and competent quarterback play after the injury to Aaron Rodgers. Now, in a majority of the alternate universes out there, Rodgers never gets hurt, and Wilson has the breakout top 10, maybe even top 5 fantasy season at the age of 22, but unfortunately for us, that was not our reality. The next category I'm calling the Tell 'em to Stay Murph moment of the year. Now, this comes from the meme or moment in the movie Interstellar, where Matthew McConaughey is looking back in time, yelling at his prior self and his daughter Murph or Murphy to make him stay and not go on this mission to save the earth. Now, of course, from a fantasy standpoint, this is just the moment where you wish you could go back in time and tell yourself to do something different. Now, the Tell 'em to Stay Murph moment of the year is for dynasty rookie drafters who took Bryce Young over CJ Stroud, of which I am including myself in one league. I had the 4th pick in a Superflex league after Bijan, Gibbs, and Richardson was taken, and I had my choice between Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, and regrettably, I took Bryce Young. Now, if you compare the two, Stroud versus Bryce Young on the season, Stroud had almost 8.5 more points per game on their rookie season. Stroud's completion percentage was 400 basis points higher. CJ Stroud passed for almost 100 yards more per game. Stroud had a touchdown to interception ratio of 23-5 compared to Bryce Young's ratio of 11 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. Stroud's accuracy, especially beyond 10 yards, was significantly higher. And if you look at their respective EPA per play, which is expected points above average per play, Stroud had a positive 0.06, which is above league average and very, very good for a rookie. Bryce Young, he had a negative 0.28. In fact, all other quarterbacks in the league who had a similarly poor EPA per play number on the season, they were all backup quarterbacks with limited games played. To put a point on this, Zach Wilson had a better EPA per play on the season than Bryce Young did. And their respective dynasty values reflect this. According to Fantasy Count, back in September, Bryce Young was ranked the 27th best asset in Superflex Dynasty rankings, whereas Stroud was ranked 51st. That quickly changed a month into the season, and as of early January, Stroud was ranked the 8th overall asset, whereas Bryce Young had fallen to 44th. The next category is called the He Can't Keep Getting Away with This Player of the Year. This is in honor of Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad, where he was just so angry and livid that Walter White continues to get the best of him. So the he can't keep getting away with this player of the year is Ravens running back Gus Edwards, because Gus Edwards finished as running back 25 on the season, even though he had the following. He had a career low 4.1 yards per carry. He was a non-factor in the passing game. He only had 13 targets on the season. And most importantly, he was only above 50% snap participation in 6 of 17 games this year. In fact, he was outside the top 40 at his position on a snaps per game basis on the entire season. He finished with 13 rushing touchdowns. He was tied for third most in the league. His previous career high was 6 touchdowns in 2020. Last year, he only had 3. Now, those 13 touchdowns, they represented 42% of his overall fantasy production. He was one of 3 running backs in the league with over 40% of their fantasy points coming via touchdowns. And anyone who owned Lamar Jackson, they felt this for a long stretch during the season. Because Gus Edwards was absolutely vulturing Lamar Jackson touchdown opportunities. From week 7 on, Gus Edwards, he scored at least 1 touchdown in 8 of 11 games. In fact, 12 of Edwards' 13 total touchdowns came in a 10-game span between weeks 7 through 17. So anyone who owned Lamar Jackson constantly looking up and yelling, he can't keep getting away with this at Gus Edwards. Now to the negatives. Let's talk about the biggest bust in fantasy football this season. I have 4 candidates. First, we'll start with Chargers running back Austin Eckler, because Eckler was a top 5 overall pick in September. However, he finished as running back 26 overall in PPR scoring, and he was running back 20 in points per game. Now, he missed weeks 2 through 4 after suffering a high ankle sprain in week 1. He returned to the Chargers after the week 5 bye. Nonetheless, he only had 4 games this year inside the weekly top 10, but he had 9 games outside the weekly top 25 at his position. Candidate 2 is Travis Kelce, the tight end of the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, on paper, Kelce still finished as tight end 3 overall on the season. It is respectable, but nowhere close to what you expected given his top 6 overall draft ADP back in September. Now, remember last year, Kelce finished with over 73 more PPR points compared to the next highest scoring tight end. And he did all that on 2 fewer games, so his points per game difference was 6.5 points better than the second best tight end. He had elite separation from the rest of the tight end field, which is why he was valued where he was back in the preseason. However, Kelce's average points per game decreased by almost 5 points, which left him in the middle of the first tier of tight ends. Again, tight end 3 overall PPR scoring, but 6 different tight ends finished between 12.5 and 14 points per game. So a pretty marginal 1.5 point difference between that top tier. Definitely not what you drafted Travis Kelce to be. The third candidate, Dolphins wide receiver Jalen Waddle. He was drafted late second, early third back in September as a borderline top 10 wide receiver selection. Unfortunately, he finished as wide receiver 34 on the season. And if we had a stat on how many blue tent visits players had over the course of the season, I think Jalen Waddle would lead the league in that category. It seemed like every week you'd get an alert that Jalen Waddle was questionable to return. In fact, Waddle only had 5 games this season where he played at least 75% of snaps. He only had 3 games where he played at least 80% of snaps. And he only had 2 top 10 weekly finishes at his position. Beyond that, Waddle in year 3 had career lows across the board in targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns. His touchdowns decreased in half from 8 last year to only 4 this season. And then the last candidate is second-year running back of the Houston Texans, Dameon Pierce. He was drafted late, early 5th round back in September as running back 17, but unfortunately Dameon Pierce was a bust from the start. Prior to getting hurt in week 8, Pierce never broke 60% snap rate, and he had 2 finishes in the weekly top 20 as running back 14 and running back 17. But the writing was already on the wall that Pierce could not transition to the Texans' new run scheme, and even after he returned from injury in week 12, he was a complete non-factor. He had less than 10 total opportunities in 7 of the Texans' last 8 games. And the biggest bust of the year award is undoubtedly going to go to Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins. Again, drafted as a borderline top 10 wide receiver. He finished as wide receiver 34, and anyone who owned Jalen Waddle knows just how much of an albatross he was on their roster this season. Numerous weeks where you would start Waddle based on his ranking, only to have him leave early due to injury and crush your week. And then your final award, the fantasy MVP, the most valuable player, the most valuable asset in all of fantasy football. And I think there's only 3 candidates. I can't imagine anyone would argue someone other than these top 3. Now, if you look at fantasy wins above replacements, that's your WAR value. These are the top 3 players across all of fantasy football this year. First, we'll talk about Christian McCaffrey. He set career highs in rushing yards. 1,459 rushing yards. He had 5.3 yards per carry. He had 21 total touchdowns. He led the league in rushing yards. He was also top 5 at his position in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. McCaffrey's 393 points in full PPR scoring formats led the NFL by a significant margin with an average of 24.5 fantasy points per game. And from weeks 1 through 17, no other player in the league, including all quarterbacks, scored more points than CMC. Your second candidate, Tyreek Hill, the wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins. Tyreek had 119 receptions for just short of 1,800 receiving yards with 13 touchdowns. He set career-high marks in target share, targets, receptions, yardage, and fantasy points. In fact, his two best fantasy seasons of his career have come the last 2 years with Miami, not any season in Kansas City. Hill was one of 3 players with over 30% target share on the season from weeks 1 through 17, and he led the league in receiving yards at over 1,700 yards. In fact, he was the only player in the league to account for over 40% of his team's receiving yardage. And then the third candidate is CeeDee Lamb, the wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, his PPR points per game from weeks 1 through 6 was only 14.9. He was 20th in the league in total PPR points. However, after the Cowboys' Week 7 bye, so from weeks 7 through 18, the final 2/3 of the season, CeeDee Lamb averaged 28.7 PPR points. Absolutely absurd video game-like production for CeeDee Lamb. In that 12-game sample, he never had a game below 9 targets. He averaged 13.5 targets per game. He averaged 115 yards receiving. He significantly outpaced the rest of the league from week 7 on in targets, receptions, yards, and he led the league with 11 touchdowns. So those are clearly the top 3 assets, top 3 players in all of fantasy football this season. But there was only one who stood above them all as the fantasy MVP, and of course that is Christian McCaffrey. His fantasy wins above replacement, his WAR score was 4.3. That is first in the league, and he was the only player above 4 on the season. Tyreek Hill was at 3.1. CeeDee Lamb on the season was at 2.7. Now, I did consider CeeDee Lamb for this award because he had the highest WAR score from week 7 on, but from the first third of the season, Lamb was only slightly above average as opposed to truly elite in the last 2/3 of the season. But back on Christian McCaffrey, to really kind of drive this home, according to Yahoo Sports, and this is quoted in a number of other fantasy platforms as well, but CMC was on almost half of the teams that played for a fantasy championship, by far the most of any player in the league this year. Christian McCaffrey carried you to the playoffs, and he won a lot of people their leagues this year. So that'll wrap up our 2023 season recap and awards. We'll be back with some additional episodes throughout the remainder of the off season. So if you got comments, questions, if you got debate that you want to bring up with some of these awards, you think somebody else should have won, let us know. Reach out to us on Twitter. Again, we are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com if you have questions that you want explored. We'll dedicate an episode to it, so go ahead and reach out to us either on Twitter or at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.